Hello, Hillmantok. Hello, Panthers. How is everyone doing? This is your favorite indie author, Kay McCoy, and today we are going to talk about week 3 of creative writing, inspiring storytelling for aspiring authors. So, for those of you that are new to the playlist, again, please be sure to check out the first video as that gives you a more in-depth explanation. But in short, Hillmantok is a unaccredited university. Thank you again for joining me today. We are going to talk about clarity. Now, I know last week we talked about coherence, and they sometimes are similar, and people do use them interchangeably. However, that is not always the case. So before we get into examples for today, I really wanted to take some time to talk about that because I know with my lesson from last week, there was a lot of things that sounded very similar to clarity because you think, oh, well, if the person understands it, then that's it. So essentially, that is what clarity is. It talks about the making the story easy for the reader to understand. The writer's job is to make sure that the story and the intent behind the story and the ideas that are shared within that story are very clear to the reader, so that way it makes it easier. As I mentioned in last week's class, there is some similarities because, again, coherence is logically making sure that the story is understandable. And again, I focus on that because as an author, the more you think about your story logically, even if you're the best storyteller, that will help you tell a story that is easier for the reader to understand. And it helps when you think about it logically, and that way things start to flow better. So coherence is important, and that's why I chose to talk about that in week 2 instead of today. So today we're going to talk about making the story as easy as possible for the reader to understand, so that way your intent and your ideas are very clear to the reader. Because more often or not, when you do tell a story or when you do publish an article or an essay, the idea has to be there. Like it has to, usually when someone finishes reading something, the first thing they ask is like, okay, so what did you read? And if the reader is looking like a deer in headlights, or if they're just standing around like, oh, well, more often or not, that's likely due to the idea not being sound. And sometimes when authors go online and they publish a story, I'm softballing this, by the way, they publish a story that is not well received, regardless of what the intent is, the impact, it does play a role in that. And this is something that we can go on and on about. Listen, I'm an introvert in real life, but if you ask me to do a TED Talk about one thing specifically, it more likely will be intent versus impact. Because you can have the best intentions when you write a story, you can have all these amazing ideas and the coherence is there, everything flows. But after a reader reads something, you can't control how they feel about that story. So having said all of that, and we talked about the difference between these two, really coherence is, in my opinion, the stepping stone, because that is the whole subject. Clarity helps you break down those very specific beats, those very specific things that make up your story. And guess what we're going to talk about today? We're going to talk about exactly that, breaking down your story in order to outline your story. And I have a few examples of how you can outline your story from free 99 on upward, because again, I've been at this for a while, so I've tried different various techniques and I know what works for me and how to change that. So again, when we talked about coherence, we really wanted to really get into how those sentences logically make sense together, like making sure that your thought in your head before you really get started on the draft is very sound. That's important. So from there, we went on to talk about checkpoints, things that help with the story. Do you have an outline? Was my number one question. And we're going to actually get into that. So again, we talked about that. We also talked about why coherence is important, again, for the general flow. And today, since we talked about clarity, we're really going to get into like the specifics of what that means. So having said that, let's go ahead and get started with the outline. So again, I've had various methods that I used over the years, and there is one that I use religiously. It's my go-to. I mean, I think everyone has a method that pretty much works for them. But before we get into that, let's talk generally about the importance of a good outline. What is it that an outline does? Like, how does that help you with telling your story? Again, your story has to make sense. It has to be coherent and there has to be clarity because that provides the structure before you do anything else, before you really get into the really drama of it all, before you get into the dialogue and before you get into the action that you want in your story. The outline gives you structure. It gives you somewhere to go. Even if you detour from the outline, at least you have a starting point and it helps clear your thought process by having an outline. For some people, it helps clear the process so that way there's no, side tracks or side quests or what have you. For other people, it can feel a little stunting. It can feel almost like it's forcing you to think only one singular way. And a lot of people, their brain just doesn't work that way. If you find that you're one of those people, that's totally fine. It again, it happens. And one way to find out for sure is by obviously creating an outline, at least giving it a shot. So we're going to talk about a few methods for doing that. And again, having an outline, it helps you build on that structure once you realize, okay, this is what I want to do for my story. This is where I see the characters right now. And it helps you with really strengthening your basics. You need your characters, you need the setting, you need tension, you need plot. So the outline, building that will help you with a firmer foundation. And if you do, again, detour, that's totally fine. Now you have something to adjust. You no longer have a blank beginning staring at you, which is probably the most daunting thing as a writer, is having that blank page stare back at you, whether it's on your laptop or in your notebook, however you choose to get those words. That's probably the most daunting part for me. So yeah, that's what it helps you to do. And also one thing that I learned when I started making outlines are crucial for me now because it helps me pinpoint those areas where I need to do the most research. If my character is in a certain profession and I want to illustrate that without having to say it, I need to do a little research. So having said that, let me see if I can give you an example. Okay, we're going to talk about this anyway. So here, can you see? Oh, there she is. So March for Justice. This is my very first, I guess you want to say, women's fiction anthology. And I love the story that I did in this story. Let me make sure I get to the right page. So it's been a while since I looked at it. So the story that I submitted for this was Protect Them at All Costs. And I love this because since I was a little kid, I've always wanted to write a story about characters that were that use sign language, like American Sign Language. And so I finally did that with A Dove's Cry, but I also extended that research that I did in this story. So one of the things that I had to make really clear in here was those characters. And I'm not someone who uses American Sign Language or ASL or BASL. I don't use that in my everyday life. I do study, but clearly I'm not conversational. And so I had to be sure to do research. And for certain scenes that I had in mind, I'm a highlighter. So I would highlight those scenes and I said, okay, this is what I want here. This is what I see here. Let me make sure that that's factual and that it's realistic in the story. So I do color coordinate my highlighters based on specific things such as feeling, action. Is this a thought or is this a fantasy? If it's a thought, that means it's something that I've researched and that I found that it could be true. How do I make it fit into my story? Fantasy. Okay, this would have been really cool, but now that I've done the research, it's not going to work for this story. Or I realized that's not going to work at all. So I had to scrap it. So that came in real handy with this. Also, I don't have an aversion against the law. I just learned to avoid the law. So there's a couple of scenes in here that are related to police precincts and procedures and things that I don't know about because I'm a civilian. So I had to make sure to do a little research on that, and I phoned a few friends to get some help in regards to that. But essentially, the story that I submitted was based off of a question: what would you do if you saw your best friend being abducted? And that question spawned this story. So, protect them at all costs. That is what's in this anthology for March for Justice. And I'm going to give you a few more breakdowns using this as an outline, because again, that is why you are here. Now, again, we talked about the connecting points of a story and how all of those things relate to the structure of a story. So now we're going to get into 4 forms. Let me see. You can see my fingers. So there are 4 forms of outlining. Okay. So the first one, let's see. The first one is the 3-act structure. This is my bae. I use 3-act structure almost religiously. Save the Cat, I am still learning about. If you want more about that, then please follow. I believe her name is Liselle Sambury. She is a Canadian author, and she has an entire playlist for Save the Cat. There's also the hero's journey and the snowflake method. So we're going to talk briefly about each one of those. And let's just go ahead and start with Save the Cat, because again, that's one that I'm still researching. And this came to be because of American screenwriter Blake Snyder. He initially created this actually for screenwriting, which is how I found out about it. And then I found Liselle Sambury on YouTube, and it goes from there. So it's essentially, it can be adapted for novels or any other form of storytelling. And it's very similar to the 3-act structure. So now that you've gone a little bit over that, let's dive right on into 3-act structure again. This is the one that I use all the time. In fact, I've used it in this story. So 3-act structure, and I keep saying that because it's probably one of my favorites. And this is when you divide the story into 3 parts, and each one you build more of the plot with each one, and the action just keeps building till you get to the end. But for me, it helps with pacing to know the 3 acts before I continue. So act 1, that's literally your intro. That's when you're meeting your characters, as you will find, and protect them at all costs. I talked about 2 best friends, and I literally have them just doing the most random, ordinary thing. And then the action takes off right after that. So act 2, now we've met the characters. You think you know what's going on. You think you're going to know what's going to happen. You see a plan formulating, and then right before you get to the pinnacle of the action, at least for this story, things don't go the way that you think they're going to. There is a detective in this story. His name is Elliot Hardison. And if you are a fan of Leverage, you know exactly where that name came from. So there's a detective, Elliot Hardison. And he is essentially on this case, and he is trying to find the people that he needs to find, and he wants things to go a certain way. He's been a detective for decades, and this case really irks him because it's a little close to the chest, so to speak. And he thinks he's figured out a way to make things right, but in doing what he thinks is right, things go incredibly wrong. So so his men are now on the scene, and things are happening, and he is really scrambling to keep it all together. So that is essentially what happens in Act 2. And then Act 3, that is pretty much the climax, and it all goes downhill from there. So the climax happens, he's got his person, and and after that, I didn't want to do an epilogue because, again, I like the 3-act structure in this story. So he's got his person. We find out what happens to the best friends by the end of the story, and it leaves on a somber ending. And that's all I'm going to say. But essentially, that's what happens in Protect Them at All Costs with March for Justice. And I love this story. I actually started working on the sequel, so to speak, to this story because it's really good. And also, a friend of mine that recently passed away, that was something that they suggested to me, was continuing this story. And I really would love to do that and honor her in that way. So that in a nutshell is the 3-act structure. All of these outlines we will talk about more if you are already on the website for the Hillmantok.com. We'll talk about them a little bit more there. I'll share a few articles with everyone. And the hero's journey is probably the one that everyone is most familiar with. But essentially, this is one of the key ways that you can grab the attention of your readers by taking them, quote unquote, on a journey along with the hero. And it pretty much starts with them in their everyday life, ordinary world. And something happens, either they are met with a problem or person, or maybe they go to an event and something pops off. And now it's like, okay, are they going to accept that they have been chosen as the hero, or are they going to they're going to say no, they're going to refuse it? And then there's a mentor involved. That's usually in the first act, like all of that happens. And then from the second act, you have, okay, now we have some trials and tribulations that they have to go through. And how do you connect with that quote unquote hero or heroine? And then they have a really big ordeal. And that's usually like at the end of Act 2. Act 3 is, okay, now they met the big bad and they survived. What happens? And that's essentially what happens with the hero's journey. So here we talked about 4 forms so far: the 3-act structure, Save the Cat, hero's journey, and finally the snowflake method. Okay, it's exactly how it sounds, which is why I love this, because the imagery is already there in your head. So the snowflake method was created by a novelist named Randy Ingermison. I probably should have looked that up, but I think that's how you pronounce the name. So just picture the imagery in your mind. It starts with a brief summary, and then you just add to it the way that snowflakes do when they fall from the sky and they land on the ground. You would usually start with a 1-sentence summary, and this is really central to the story. So you really want to make sure that it outlines the conflict as well as the force, like what is propelling this story. So you start with that sentence. There are lots of examples. If you think about movie trailers, like that one question they ask, in a world, like who will succeed and who will fall, that kind of vibe. And then you expand upon it. So think of like, and this is my interpretation of it, but again, out of the 5 steps for the snowflake method, because again, there are 5 steps for this one. So it's almost like a movie trailer and then an extended movie trailer. And then you start to see the characters. You get like a profile of them, like right away at the introduction. You learn what their characteristics are. You learn what their role is in the story and what conflicts they have. What moves them? What really motivates them? Do they get an arc? How big is that arc? Are they going to be the secondary character or the main character? So that part is really important. And by this point, you have a little backstory about them, their personalities, their relationships, and yeah, you go from there. And then again, if it is more than one character, which in most cases you will have, so you use this to outline the main scenes, the key plot, like those little beats, and I keep referring to them as beats because that's how I think of it. But these are the little things that take place throughout the story that moves the story forward. And then again, you think about your character's arc. That's why you have the main character and then a secondary character, because there's usually a genre and then a subgenre. So that is what really helps you to hone in on the story, to really breathe life into it, to really go for it and like flesh out certain things within the story. So that way people really enjoy reading it and they get lost in that. So with the snowflake method, what I really like about this one is that it builds and it's slow. Like I'm a slow burn like reader forever. So when the story starts very simple and you add different layers to it, that just gives it more complexity. And you gradually get all of these elements to work together that is easily understood by the reader. And it's really cool when you have a dope concept or when you have a really dope concept for it and you're not really quite sure where it's going to land right away. I think the snowflake method is probably ideal for someone in that situation. And again, there are other methods like, the scene and sequel. I haven't used this one quite yet, but maybe someday. Then there's the plot pyramid. There are lots of different outlining like stages that you can use, but for me, those are the top four that I would recommend, especially if you are new to writing. If you've only written like short stories or essays, I feel that these four forms of outlining are probably the most ideal for you and they would be easier to try. And again, if you do try it and you realize you don't like it, it's totally fine. But again, this semester you will try. Try you must. Okay. So having said that, let's get into a few examples. Like I said, here, this is my anthology for March for Justice. The story is Protect Them at All Costs, and I use the 3-act method. My favorite way of writing stories, it varies. Okay, it really depends on the mood that I'm in. So I have multiple mediums that I use. You can use Google. No one's going to stop you. You can use Google Docs, Microsoft. There are other platforms like Noveler, which I love. It is a company for authors, by authors, and I believe it is also ran by authors. They're really dope. Dabble is great if you are someone who writes, like you don't write in chronological order. Dabble is really great because then you can just go in there, write a scene, write all the scenes you want, and then piece them together. If your brain works that way, it's totally fine. You can also like create character profiles in there. Outline, you can definitely outline on Dabble. Chef's kiss, I love Dabble. Again, Dabble and Noveler are my go-tos. I also do a lot of writing by hand. So when I'm writing certain scenes, I like to use like index cards. I don't know if you guys can see, but these are different colors. So I have them different colors for a reason, because again, when I'm writing like specific scenes, make sure I'm not showing y'all something you want me to see. But yeah, like when you write different scenes, like if it's act 1, it's probably going to be blue for me. Act 2, the index card is usually pink because that's when, stuff is about to pop off. And then the yellow is like act 3. I also use this. So depending on what I'm writing, if I'm working on a story that's probably going to have a sequel, like they have these little tabs on each one. So that way I know like, okay, this is potentially book 1, book 2, book 3. And then there's also this. I'm not kidding. When I say I like to write by hand, I write by hand. So this is Plotter on paper, and I am currently using this to I guess you can say re-outline, like restructure my first ever series attempt, which is Magic. So I am using this to really go through and like reorganize that and see if I can revamp it. Right now, books 1 and 2 are out on Drafted Digital. Book 3, you can find like, I've posted a little bit about each one of those on, is it Wattpad? Yeah. So essentially, I wanted it to be 5 books. I wanted it to be 5 books. It didn't quite happen that way. So I'm starting over again. So this has been like super helpful, and it's like very detailed. I've been meaning to talk about this on my YouTube channel for months now. I'm gonna get there. Okay. So Again, there are many methods. The plotter on paper, you can find that online. I'll be sure to post a link. So if that's something that you're interested in. Also, Google is free. If you got Google Docs, please use it. These index cards and the index booklets, Dollar Tree, $1.25. So yeah, you have multiple avenues that you can explore for your writing. So having said that, let's go ahead and recap. Okay, we talked about the difference between coherence, which we covered in week 2, and clarity. So be sure to share in the comments with me if you know the difference between coherence and clarity. What is it? Also, we talked about an outline. And tell me in the comments, what is it that you want to try as far as story outline? Do you want to give the 3-act method a try? Do you want to try the hero's journey or save the cat? Which one do you want to give a try? Or have you tried using one of these outlines before? Let me know in the comments. Again, an outline, it's really just, it's a blueprint for you. And you don't always have to stick to the blueprint, but it's always good to have one. So again, your story outline, it needs to include your main characters. We need to know who they are, your secondary characters even. We need to know the setting, time frame. Time frame is huge because that also can help you with creating tension. So knowing is this all taking place in a month? Is this happening in 3 months? Is this happening in the course of a year? Let the reader know that. Also, what is the conflict? What's creating the tension? And the summary. So, any other thing that you want to include in your outline. Also, research, because you will at some point have to do research. So, having said that, let's go ahead and shout out some homework. So, homework, Q&A, and books. Here, I want you to tell me about a book that you've recently read, and can you tell me, this again is simply your opinion. I want you to tell me what outline you think that that book used, if they used any at all. But you also have to tell me why. So if you think that they didn't use an outline, you have to tell me why you think that. And if you think that they used any of the 4 outlines that we talked about today, tell me which one it is and why you think that. Okay? So that is it for today. Week 4. Wow, we're already there. So week 4, we're going to talk about organization. And I am very much looking forward to it. And don't forget, if you are enrolled in this class, you have a quiz. So go take it. Go over to thehillmantok.com and you can now access the quiz. So I hope you've all looked at your vocabulary sheets, because that is your quiz. All right. Again, I am your favorite indie author, Kay McCoy. As always, continue reading, continue writing, continue loving the process, and I'm signing out. So have a good one. Bye, everyone.